When one thinks of the subject of nuclear science, one might think of the nuclear bomb or Chernobyl. They'll think of destructions and of explosions. Well, I cannot blame them. Nuclear science is indeed pure chaos. It shows that we humans have become too powerful. We can't handle the power of gods. History shows again and again that we continue to misuse this power. Most of the time, it'll be in the hands of radical or the corrupt. Yes, sometimes we can't delay the inevitable, but we can prove that all it would take would be a push of a button. In this video, I'll be going over the more chaotic bits of nuclear science, the history of meltdowns and of nuclear bombs. Let's start from 1945, the Manhattan Project. Most people know this as the final nail in the coffin for the Axis powers. The United States unleashed its radioactive fury on Japan, Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. This ended up costing more than 200,000 lives. It also started the fear that the US would unleash it again, but on rivals. The Cold War with the Soviets was driven by that factor. The Soviets ended up testing their own nuclear bomb in 1949. The Americans followed up with a more powerful bomb known as the hydrogen bomb in 1952. The Soviets ended up creating their first thermonuclear bomb in 1953. Then, on October 30th, 1961, the Soviets unleashed their Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear bomb known to mankind. Imagine the casualties if either side decided to unleash these weapons of destruction. Now that we discussed the nuclear bomb, let's move on to the accidents. The events that happened thanks to human error, specifically nuclear reactor meltdowns. The first meltdown happened in 1961 to the SL-1 reactor in Idaho, United States. The events happened as follows. 3 workers were in charge of the reactor operation on January 3rd, 1961. If you don't know how a reactor works, I would suggest watching my previous video explaining the 2 types of nuclear reactions, how a reactor works, and how a thermonuclear bomb works. Now, back to the story. This reactor was quite different from today's reactors. It was a smaller reactor with 5 control rods. These 5 control rods had to be raised manually. However, one of these rods had more power than the others. This was the central control rod. It had the power to start a nuclear reaction and stop it by itself. Nowadays, nuclear scientists consider this a fatal flaw. One control rod having all the power alone is a disaster waiting to happen. And sadly, it did. The instructions that night were to raise the central control rod by 4 inches. The person raising it had to pick up a more than 80-pound rod and raise it to 4 inches. Now, what happened next is a mystery. The operator raised it to more than 4 inches and it got stuck. A few milliseconds later, the reactor suffered a meltdown. It became too hot. The water inside the reactor became steam. The pressure made the lid of the reactor blow. The control rods flew off, along with the person raising them. 2 of the operators died instantly. The other one died a couple of minutes after being rescued from the reactor hall. The mystery was of the question of who to blame. Control rods were known to get stuck, but at the exact same time, the person raising these rods were facing problems at home, including his wife being accused of an affair with one of his colleagues. The colleague in question was right next to him. Was this a suicide murder, or was this an accident? We could never know. But what we learned from this accident was that this reactor design was flawed. All control rods should be equal in power. Lucky for us, this was a small reactor meltdown compared to the next disaster. Let's talk about Chernobyl's reactor number 4. The Chernobyl accident of 1986 was the result of 3 things. 1. A flawed reactor design. 2. Inexperienced operators doing a complicated test. 3. Quote-unquote, wrong time, wrong place. Let me explain the reasoning behind these claims. The reactors had a button we know as AZ5. This is the equivalent of the scram button the American reactors have. AZ5 would have all control rods reinserted back into the reactor. This would have supposedly cooled the reactor. This was a failsafe the operators could use if their reactor was in a critical state. The button would have been pushed, and the control rods would have come in, saving the day from a nuclear reactor meltdown. So we thought. AZ5 would spike power because the materials included 2 things: boron, which would decrease activity, and graphite, which would increase activity. In the configuration Chernobyl was in, which I'll explain later, AZ-5 was their detonator. This proves claim 1, flawed reactor design. Before I go on to prove the second claim, I'll explain the safety test the reactor 4 was to complete. The scenario would be like this. The reactor shuts down because of a loss of electricity powering the water pumps. The theory was if the turbines could spin long enough to generate the electricity until the backup generators kicked in, the reactor would be placed on low. They'll see how long the turbine would spin until the backup generators kicked in. Confusing, right? Well, think of someone with no experience in doing this test and pressured in completing it. This proves the second claim that reactor operators were too inexperienced. The last claim, quote-unquote, wrong time, wrong place. During the hours that led up to the disaster, reactor number 4 was kept at half power to provide electricity for the nearby city of Kiev. This was because something happened to their coal plant. While it was at half power, an element we know as xenon formed in the reactor. Xenon absorbs neutrons, which would cause the reactor to produce less electricity. It would also push the reactor to an unstable state. The inexperienced crew first pulled out all the control rods from the reactor, causing the xenon to burn. Then they pressed the AZ-5 button, which got the control rods back in, but by then, it was already too late. The graphite tip rods spiked reactivity. The heat caused the water in the reactor to turn into steam. The pressure was so great that the 1,000-ton reactor lid flew off and landed back. The explosion caused the entire building's roof to collapse. Now, we have an open reactor with radioactive gases seeping out and contaminating nearly all of Europe. In a rush, the Soviet Union assembled a makeshift roof known as the sarcophagus to contain these gases. Today, the situation has been resolved thanks to a building built over the reactor and the sarcophagus, which is taking apart this makeshift roof and the reactor itself. Chernobyl was an old event that happened in 1986. What if I told you that we experienced another Chernobyl 25 years after the incident? The Fukashima power plant in Japan experienced 2 explosions. Both of these were caused because of a tsunami that hit the area on March 11, 2011. The events, simply put, are as follows. The emergency generators which cooled the reactor got knocked out because of the seawater from the tsunami. Reactor 1 exploded, Reactor 3 followed, and nearly caused the explosion of Reactor 2. That was a nutshell of what happened. The events that occurred in Fukushima deserve a separate video dedicated to explaining the events in detail. Nuclear science is without a doubt a chaotic branch in the subject of science. It can destroy us, turn cities to rubble, cause governments and countries to cease existence. In fact, if it is in the wrong hands, which is most of the time, it can eliminate us all. But at the exact same time, it can power cities and countries. It can save us from climate change. It all depends if we learn from the past and put it in effect in the future. Hey guys, thanks for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to press the like button. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. It would be great help if you would go down to the comments and tell us what topic we should lecture about next. Once again, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.